Hello, welcome to another episode of Lessons from a Podcaster. Today, here with me, Tom from Media Cage. Hey, Tom, thank you for joining us.
Tiago, lovely to speak to you. Thank you for inviting me to come along.
So, tell me about this incident. You're in the kayak, and suddenly the kayak starts sinking with all the recording equipment. I don't know, it seems so surreal, and I would love to learn more about it.
Yeah, so this is at the beginning of my audio producer journey. I learnt lessons quite fast. We do a podcast for a conservation association, so people that look after the countryside here in England, look after the rivers and things like that. And so we were recording a series for them, and there was one episode where we had to get onto the river itself. We do water testing, we test the wildlife, and I thought, brilliant, kayaks. They said, don't worry, we'll provide the boats. So I turned up and thinking it would be a proper boat, but no, it was an inflatable kayak. So I was a bit unsure the first 5 minutes, looking at all my equipment in my bag, thinking, well, that bag's not waterproof. None of my equipment is waterproof, but I'm sure it will be okay. These guys know what they're doing. And within about half an hour, I thought this boat's getting a little low in the water here. And sure as, like, the inflatable kayak had a small hole in my one, just my one. They were fine in their own. Just me, the guy with all the recording equipment, microphones, headphones, laptop in my bag. So yeah, and I was just going down and down and down and down. So I managed to paddle to the side. By this time, water was coming in, and I just packed my bag up with stuff and threw it onto the riverbank.
Oh, wow.
And that rolled, which was good. Like, that was safe. And I just basically did the whole recording on my waterproof iPhone. So that was the whole thing done. But this is brilliant thing about technology now, and how easy it is to record and create this content. I managed to do a pretty good job on an iPhone, and in the post, in the edit afterwards, I just played with the audio, the equalizers, and made it sound all right. But I got away with it, Tiago. Yeah, that was not a fun day for me.
I would love to see that video. It must have been really stressful. The
that
exciting
was the only good thing. No video on the day, just audio.
Yeah.
So this is that saved me a bit.
Wow, the exciting life of a podcast media company. So you are you work for Media Cage.
I founded Media Cage. Yeah, with a friend of mine. And I'll just briefly tell your listeners what we do. We are a podcast production service, and we can help out clients. So we work with businesses and organizations, magazines, charities, businesses, anyone that wants a podcast that doesn't have the time, the resources to put their staff onto it. We can come in and help them. Most of the time we do everything from the idea, the format, the concept at the beginning, all the way through. We help them record, find a host, get the music, everything. And then we get the podcast out. So that's sort of as a business, that's what we've been doing since 2018.
Wow, that's incredible. So as our listeners know, our first season of the Lessons from a Podcaster, we interviewed mostly podcasters. And now we are interviewing media companies and podcast agencies. And there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm curious about how did you get into podcasting? And so first, since when did you start the Media Cage? And yeah, tell me a bit the story on how did you come to this podcasting industry?
So I started my career in radio. So by trade, I'm a radio presenter here in England. Okay. I've been doing morning radio breakfast shows for 20 years this year. So I started in 2004 as a young man, doing music radio, music breakfast, competitions, pop music, news, weather, that kind of stuff, showbiz stories. And so it got sort of to 2018. And I was looking for a new challenge. I didn't want to get up early anymore. I've been getting up at 4 a.m. for 20 years.
Wow.
It was driving me. My body was so tired. My wife and kids were like, please, we want a human being back, And so a friend of mine and I, a producer friend that worked with me over the years, we left together. We worked for a big global company called Global. That's their name here. So they own Heart FM, Capital Radio, XFM, LBC, big radio station's parent company here in the UK. So we left, and to be honest, podcasts I'd always listened to from when they started hanging around, kicking off, mainly because I was working in music radio, and the last thing I wanted to do every day on the way home was listen to more music. I was like, I just need to change what's in my head. So that's when podcasting, I experienced and found podcasting, and I just loved it. I loved the format. I loved that there's a show out there for anybody, no matter how niche your passion. And so we started off with one client, and we literally started from scratch. We said, right, let's put a couple of demo podcasts together. And we went out there and we just called people, emailed people, clients that we'd worked with through the radio stations over the years. And one client said, yeah, let's do this. Another client was like, no, let's not. So, we built up, and then just from there, we've just expanded. And of course, as soon as you get one client, another one comes on, and you get a portfolio of business. And so it went from there, really. So radio into podcasting, it was a natural progression.
Wow. This is great to have someone that started in radio and moved to podcast, because I can ask the question that I always have in my mind, which is, what is the difference between having an interview in a radio program and having an interview in a podcast? Or is it actually basically the same, just rebranded to the name of podcast?
For me, it's very, very different. In the world of radio, in music radio, you get 2 minutes to 3 minutes every time you talk. That's it. You're limited. You have certain amount of songs to get out. You have adverts to get out. You have the news, the weather. You've got to keep to time. Speech radio is different, where it's just talk. You have a bit more flexibility, but still there are limitations. Podcasting is great. You can just go. You can really explore. You don't worry about time. A podcast can be 43 minutes, 12 seconds. It could be 12 minutes. It doesn't matter how long it is. You're finished when you're finished, as long as the content's good and strong, of course. Radio, you've got a clock, you've got a producer waving at you, round up, 3 minutes to go, 1 minute, 30 seconds. You've got to get all your questions in hard and fast, get to the meat of the content. And podcasting just gives you that flexibility, which is why I absolutely love it.
So you are more on the clock. You cannot be as flexible when you're in the radio. Perhaps as well, the type of conversations you can have, the type of language you can use is also different.
Yeah, exactly that. And you can explore. And the beauty is, of course, that your podcast is always edited. So if something goes wrong, or it doesn't go wrong, but maybe not to plan, and you take your guest down a path you think this might work, and it doesn't, that's wonderful. You've got time afterwards to edit and make it a nice rounded product, where in radio, if it's live, you're in trouble.
Yeah, it's less stressful, I assume. Yeah. So you work mostly at the moment with branded podcasts. What are branded podcasts?
Okay, so a branded podcast is a podcast show that is owned and run by a business or a charity or an organization. Okay. So it's not a show that someone has created themselves, an original one. So, for example, it might be, if the government have a podcast, which certain departments here in the UK have, then that's branded. If a famous magazine has a podcast to go along with their magazine, that's classed as branded. If there's a company name behind it, not just someone starting it off from scratch.
Okay, got it. And the other type of podcasts, how would you call them? Original podcasts?
Yeah, we would call them original here. So in the UK, I'm not too sure around the world, but here in the UK, they're split into two, really. Original podcasts and then branded.
Okay. So they're very different styles, right? Because I assume that branded podcasts, they mostly make money. They are a marketing source for the business, right? So they eventually make money by bringing customers trust to the business, whereas original make money mostly through ads. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. I mean, there is a crossover there, but you'll find that most clients we work with, the idea for starting it, and half of it is to make money further down the line, monetize their podcast if they can by getting it sponsored and getting adverts on, like originals. Okay. I mean, originals is good, but there is that element to it as well. But I'm always telling clients, don't start a podcast to make money. That can't be the number one reason, because it'll take time. If you do make money, it'll take time to get there. Why do you want to make this podcast? For most of, if not all our clients, it is as a tool, an accessory, an accompanying marketing piece, really, if you will, for their main product. For a magazine, You get a podcast for each episode of the magazine, a copy of the magazine that comes out. They might feature we're doing one now with a history magazine.
Okay.
And they have a feature in each monthly magazine. There's a feature on a big battle, and their podcast they want is just focused on that feature. So, it's just a little extra that they can, in the magazine, say, check out our podcast for more details on this article feature. So, yeah, it's a nice sort of accompanying piece for most of our clients.
Got it. Let's take that example, the example of the magazine. I'm curious. So they write an article about the battle, and where do you come in? Like, do you get a host for them? Do they give like someone from their team that hosts this? Like, what is the kind of support that Media Cage gives to this history magazine?
So, okay, this client is a perfect example of the process that we do. So with these guys, they wanted their editor to be the host, the magazine editor, the big honcho, the head of it, to be the host. And their thinking is, they've written their magazine, they've spent their month getting their magazine ready, and so they have the content, they've prepped already. Really, they can just tweak it and shape it into content for the podcast, which is great. And so I had to say very kindly and as nice as possible to the editor of the magazine, you haven't got the greatest voice. We did some demos, we got some audio together, have a listen back. You're quite monotone. There's no real sort of character in your voice. And he understood that. So he got another member of their team who does a bit of amateur drama, loves acting, and happened to be brilliant. So we've got to be open and honest with them about, the voice, because as soon as you get a host on that's not great, doesn't connect with the audience, you've lost that listener within 40 seconds to a minute.
How do you evaluate that? Like, what do you look for? What does it mean to have a good voice for a podcast?
Tone of voice, character in the voice, where you're up and down and not just talking like this the whole time. And this is a really interesting. It's got to be an interesting listen. If you listen to radio hosts around the world, they're there because they've got a great voice and they know how to perform. It's an art form. It's a type of performance. What you're doing here, you're delivering the content in an entertaining and engaging way. And the statistics show that it takes between 40 and 60 seconds for a new listener to engage with the host or not. And if they don't engage with you, regardless of what the content's like, they're not going to come back to your podcast.
Are there any techniques on how to start? Because if those 60 seconds are so important, how shall one start their episodes? Shall I try to make it very extrovert and use all the capabilities of my voice? Shall I try to get a hook and get them engaged? What shall I do?
Yeah, so exactly that. You got to try and tease them through. So we love teasers at Media Cage. A lot of our podcasts will have a short intro. It's important, I think, to have a very short intro. Okay. This is a rule I learned in my early days of radio. Just get straight into the meat of the content. Don't faff around at the beginning. All these podcasts that do like 7 minutes of chat with the two hosts before the guests come on. I'm like, come on, guys. The reason I've clicked on this episode is because you're talking to whoever it is, the person I want to hear. I don't want to, let's get straight in. So we do a short, sharp intro, no longer than a minute. If we can get some clips of later on, some funny parts of the interview, we can make a little music montage where it all sounds fun and high energy. Let's throw that at the beginning and then let's get straight in. So that for me is the number one most important thing. Let's get straight into it. Okay. Unless later down the line you're getting 10,000 listens an episode and people are there for you as a host and your co-host,
then you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, slightly different. You are they're coming for you more than the guest, sorry, in that respect. But early days, I would say tease ahead. This is what we got coming up. Maybe a little clip, bit of music, just get straight in.
So going back to the example of the history magazines, who writes the script? Is there a script, first of all? And is it you? Is Media Cage that writes the script, or do they provide the script? How does that go?
Early days, we work with the client to, we really are advocates of bullet points rather than scripts, because if you're not an experienced presenter, you can tell when someone's reading. And so, but this is a huge part of the process for us is doing pilot shows with the team to sort of discover what they're like as a presenter, as their presentation skills. And if they can read a script and actually it sounds great, you wouldn't know they're reading. then fine. But most of the time we'll say, let's do bullet points and put it into your own words. And it works pretty quick. Look, it takes time. It takes 3 or 4 episodes for them to get used to it. But yeah, it's all about sounding casual and relatable as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny that you say that, because for everything, right, when you start, especially people that are starting for the first time in the podcasting world, their first episodes won't be great, but it's still their first episodes. So when people are coming and engaging with the podcast, they will listen to those first episodes that might not be the best. So how do you handle that?
Well,
like, do you re-record them later on?
No, there's nothing you can do really with that. Okay. I think it's accepted a little bit. The whole thing about the podcast world, it's accepted at the minute. I think it's rough and ready. It's not quite as, it doesn't have to be slick and professional, as long as the main part of the content is good. There's nothing you can do about it. It's an interesting question, actually. You know, as much as you can force it, you've just got to hope that it builds. It builds over time, and you get that fan base, and people engage with it as much as they can. Yeah.
So, do you do live recordings? Do you go to these people's brands and companies to record with them?
Yes, we do. We do a real mixture. We are working with a Premier League football club, Brighton and Hove Albion, at the minute, and we are weekly. That's a weekly show, so we go into their training ground for that one, cool. which is amazing, because we're in amongst the players, and we have they built a little studio in there out of a meeting room, and so that's weekly. And what we try and do is 2 or 3 episodes a day, so we don't have to go in every week. It helps the hosts for that one. But so a lot of it's that. A lot of it is remote, like we're doing today. It depends on the client, and we try and make it easy for people. A lot of people, companies that work, and the hosts have day jobs. They want to do it in the evening at home, and that's fine. And with technology the way it is at the minute, audio wise, it's pretty great.
Does it make a difference to do a show like we are doing now, each one of us in our own homes with our laptops, as opposed as doing in both of us under the same roof, recording together?
Yeah. It depends on the host, but yes, I think it does actually. Being face to face, it helps. And more than anything, before you hit record, you've broken the ice. You're meeting people. How are you? Everything okay? Right. It makes that sort of first transition from the meeting into the recording a lot easier. So we prefer face to face if possible. Yeah.
Right. I'm fascinated about this whole like branded podcast, because it's something that it's growing a lot. More and more you see companies like yours all across the world. There in Portugal, there's a bunch of them, and in the US, everywhere. So I'm curious to know what is, since you are in the industry, how has the industry been evolving? Do you notice that more companies recognize the value of podcasting? Is it easier for you to get customers, or is it the opposite? Is it becoming more saturated and harder to land new leads?
Very much both, actually. The podcast industry is hugely saturated. If you look at the statistics, I don't know what they are. I can't remember what they are, but let's say there's like 40% of podcasts that are available, like shows that have been registered, just aren't even used, or they have 6 episodes or less, or something crazy like that. So people are starting them from home because it's so easy, and they're not continuing. I would say what's interesting to me, a client, I had a meeting with a client last week. We haven't started with them yet, but we're just in that initial talking stage. And I said, they contacted us and they said, we want to start a podcast. And I went, great. First question I always ask is why? And they went, oh, well, we don't know, but we feel we should have one. I was like, okay. And that's the kind of a message I'm hearing a bit now. These big companies feel they should have one because everyone else does. Maybe it's a good thing to do. So there is a little bit of that going on. And it's quite difficult that when someone comes to you with that, because you have to look at what they do as a company, as a business, as an organization, and say, well, have you got the content to create a show? I mean, it's all very well having one. In this particular case, this was the marketing team that contacted me. They get a budget every year, and they're running out of ideas. They're putting Instagram posts up, and Facebook posts, and X, and then LinkedIn, all great, but they're just running out of stuff. They've got to create content every day. And they thought, a podcast, brilliant. We could do so much with that. There's so many things we could do with publicizing a podcast. So I thought that was
Yeah.
quite an interesting. Little sort of indication of where things might be heading. It's very popular. Podcasts are cool now. They're trendy at the minute. Whether that dips, I don't know. I hope it doesn't, obviously. But yeah. So I think it's very much a double-edged sword there. The market is saturated with rubbish, but there's some great stuff in there as well.
What are the KPIs that businesses look at when, or the analytics that they most care about when they release their episodes?
It is literally numbers of downloads per episode, because they know that to eventually monetize their show, they've got to get to a certain decent amount. I think at the minute it's like 5,000 listens per episode. You can start thinking about monetizing it. I started thinking about advertising. You're not going to make much off that. When you get to 10,000, it may be like 30 to 50 pounds of advertising revenue an episode. 50,000 upwards, you're looking maybe a couple of £100 of advertising an episode. So that's what they're looking for. Early days, we make it very clear to a client, please don't expect great things from the off. It's just not going to happen. A lot of the time we suggest people do that release in seasons. So we'll say, let's do 10 episodes, give that a break, and we can really push those 10 over the next year. If you like it, if it's gone well enough for you, if you feel you've got the content to do another 10, we'll come back and do season 2. That's one way of sort of judging whether everyone's got the energy, because you don't want to commit to doing a weekly show or a monthly show, let alone a weekly show, and then just run out of time, run out of energy. So committing to 10 is quite a nice sort of benchmark to set your sights to.
Yeah, no, makes sense. I'm curious about, obviously, companies. You're saying that they get into 5,000, 10,000 downloads. That's a way for them to monetize. But is that normal? Like that companies are able to reach that with their shows? Because for me, a show with 5,000 downloads per episode is already something quite big. So yeah, I guess what percentage of what in 100, let's say, companies trying that, what would be the percentage of companies that actually get to these numbers? And my second question is it actually required to be successful to get these numbers, or can you find success in lower numbers like 200, 500 downloads?
You can do, very much so. It depends on, it's difficult. It depends on what the company is and what their product is. So a small, I'm trying to think of an example, a small boat company that lives, maybe I'm on the coast on the south of England. If there was a local boat company, a sailing, and they wanted to produce a sailing podcast for the area, talking about the events and things like that, they're not expecting 50,000. They're expecting the local community that's relevant to them. Mm-hmm. And if they can get up to 500 or 1,000, that's great. We've got a magazine on the books. We do the Horse and Hound podcast, which is a famous horse magazine over here. When we launched, there was no horse magazine in the country doing a podcast. And I found this gap, and I approached them because I realized that England is horse crazy. The United Kingdom, we love our horses, and people spend so much money and time on them. But there was there's lots of fan podcasts, but there was no dedicated authoritative voice. And this magazine was the biggest horse magazine in the country. So we went to them and said, look, there's a gap here. No one is doing an official horse magazine that looks at the latest eventing, the Olympics, and covers all the big events and that kind of thing. And that's now doing great guns and getting huge, huge numbers. But that's such a massive audience. Anyone in the country that loves horses can relate to this podcast. So, yeah, it depends on who you are and what your product is, essentially. Right. So the sailing one will be happy with 1,000 because they're targeting. They know that every single one of those listeners is completely invested in what they're listening to. So, yeah.
Do you also provide the marketing support to get more listeners for their shows?
To a point, we provide the marketing content. So we will put together reels for them. We will put together infographics, audiograms, which is very popular at the minute. So you've got the quotables. You've got a quote on a graphic on Instagram, and then you've got the sound wave going at the bottom, that kind of thing. So we can provide that content as part of the service we do. A lot of clients will have a team that will do that. So we'll just provide them the audio on a file, we'll upload the podcast, but then give them a copy of it themselves, and they'll just cut and paste bits they want, and they've got a design department. But yeah, absolutely. And there's plenty of programs online that will, like PodSqueeze, you put your details in, upload your episode, and then suddenly you've got plenty of options of all different marketing tools there. It's great.
Yeah, this is a great way for us to end this conversation, which is the question that everyone has. What is the best way, and this is both for media companies, original, branded shows, what is the best way, in your opinion, to grow a show and get more listeners? Besides, okay, let's say you have a good content, marketing-wise, what works best?
Okay, so there are 4 areas really to focus on. Number 1, nothing beats word of mouth. I think that's still the number 1 way of promoting your podcast. Cross-promote with other shows in your genre if you can. If you've got an interview show, get the host of a similar podcast on. Don't be scared of that, and say, credit their show, and they'll go back and credit your show. Cross-promote.
Right.
Just because I'm a football fan, a soccer fan, I listen to 5 different football podcasts. I'm not loyal to one. I listen to 5. So you've got to understand that if you've got a history podcast, that your listeners also going to listen to other history podcasts, and that's the way it is. So cross-promote. I'm a big fan of referencing older episodes. You become focused a lot on marketing each new episode, but don't forget about your catalog of older shows. Getting more downloads for the older episodes will really boost your listener stats. That's key. Number 3, I'd say really focus and nail your podcast SEO. Make sure you are visible as much as possible. Good, Google search, essentially SEO practice isn't just about stuffing your content with keywords, and it's about using them appropriately and contextually to enhance the quality of your show. So that's really important. Do some research on how to get good SEO. And a website is the other thing I encourage everyone to have, a dedicated website for your show. Once it gets to a certain level, it's a home for the show. It serves as a central hub for your audience, so they can check in with the latest news, newsletters, and you build a following, you build a community there. There's show notes, there's presenter bios, there's other material there, and it's a contact page, so you get great feedback, questions from your listeners. So yeah, those are the sort of 4 areas I'd really focus on.
And those are really great tips. Thank you so much, Tom. Tell us again the name of your company. How can we find you? How can we find your company? All the links, everything. Tell us.
Best thing to do is jump onto our website, which is mediacage.co.uk, and you can read all about us on there.
Perfect. I will also link it in the show notes of this episode. Thank you very much, Tom. It was a pleasure.
Lovely to catch up. Thanks, Tiago.
This podcast is brought to you by PodSqueeze, an essential tool for podcasters that creates show notes, timestamps, clips, and more. Visit podsqueeze.com and use the code PODCASTER for 20% discount in the first 3 months. We release a new episode every Tuesday and Thursday. See you in the next episode of Lessons from a Podcaster.